So even today we see this like persistent cultural narrative that a mother's sexuality is essentially stripped away when she becomes a mother. So women are sorted into categories of feminine identity, they aren't allowed to be multidimensional. Rebecca Bromwich and Monique Marie de Jong talk about how mother work and sex work are perceived as like polar opposites. So mothering is viewed as a legitimate use of female embodiment, as they put it, whereas sex work is perceived as the illegitimate use of female embodiment. So mother work and sex work are thought to be performed by different kinds of bodies, different kinds of women.
Hello and welcome to episode 13 of Amorous Histories. I'm Annie, thank you for joining me. If you like the vibes, you can follow me wherever you get your podcasts and on social media. I'm at Amorous Histories on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube and TikTok, and at Amorous Hist Pod on Twitter. You can like, share, comment and all of that good stuff. Transcripts and sources for each show are available on the website amoroushistories.co.uk, along with links to bookshop.org affiliate account and some other goodies. Today I'm joined by Alexandra Collinson, a third-year PhD student at Newcastle University studying 18th century literature. We'll be talking about her project, The Sex Workers' Revolution, Prostitution and Feminism in Women's Writing, 1787 to 1801, and more broadly about women, sex work, virtue and motherhood in 18th century England and Ireland. Alex's PhD project asserts that revolutionary feminists such as Marie-Madeleine, Jodin and Mary Wollstonecraft were not the only female writers to intervene in the patriarchal domain of late 18th century politics. Her research shows that sex workers like Margaret Leeson and Sheldon also made important contributions to feminist discourses on women's nature and social roles in memoirs and legal testimonies published throughout the period. Alex's other research interests include women's life writing and representations of sexuality, maternity and prostitution in 18th century literature. Her PhD project is funded by an Arts and Humanities Research Council Northern Bridge studentship. Alex has recently presented at the BARS conference in Edinburgh and the British Society of 18th Century Studies conference in Oxford, where she was shortlisted for the President's Prize for the Best Postgraduate Paper. Upon submission of her PhD, Alex will be working towards the publication of a monograph based on her thesis, comparing courtesans' memoirs with the works of writers now known as revolutionary feminists, and demonstrating how these memoirists expand and complicate radical feminist debates about female virtue that took place at the end of the 18th century. I, for one, am very excited about that. Could you give us a broad overview of sex work in the 18th century?
So in my research, I'm focusing on prostitution in late 18th century England and Ireland. And the memoirs I'm concentrating on centre on women's experiences between roughly the 1770s to the 1790s. Obviously, there's not one single story of prostitution in that period, so there was a massive variety of sex work. So ranging from street walking to managing or working in a brothel, and of course there were different kinds of brothels. Some elite, some catering to certain sexual tastes, certain aesthetic preferences as well, to kept womanhood, and obviously the very elite upper echelons of courtship as well. And women from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds engaged in sex work. So there were brothels called Ebony Bets and Black Harriets, which employed black women in London too. In terms of geography, there were particular parts of London, such as King's Place, St James's, Covent Garden, that were associated with prostitution. And obviously this houses a list of Covent Garden ladies, which I think you talked about on a previous episode, which is obviously essentially a catalogue of sex workers published during the late 18th century. And it gives us all kinds of details about this and the prices that women were charging as well. Leeson, one of the memoirs I'm focusing on, gives us a lot of insight into the demand for prostitution near military garrisons in Ireland as well. So some of her clients were English military men and politicians and aristocrats visiting or living in Dublin. I'm focusing on women's experiences of prostitution, but as you've discussed as well in a previous podcast episode, it's important to note that there's some sex workers were men. So often working in underground molly houses at a period in which homosexuality was punishable by death. So I'd really recommend the work of the historian Randolph Trumbach if listeners want to investigate this further as well. In terms of how women got into sex work, it was often the case that they were raped, or as it was frequently described in the period, seduced. at a young age and became pregnant outside of marriage or were otherwise impoverished and needing to support themselves or their families. There were limited employment opportunities for women, and without male support, prostitution was often the only viable way to make money. Some labouring class women engaged in prostitution on odd occasions when they needed some extra cash, but many became sex workers in the long term and often established successful careers out of it as well. Just to make a quick note as well about terminology, obviously the terms sex work and sex worker weren't used during the 18th century. They were first coined by the activist Carol Lee in the 70s. However, the noun prostitute has been and is often used in really dehumanising terms. And also, as Melissa Dura-Grant notes, prostitute is at root a verb, so to prostitute somebody or something. So to apply to a person can function to really define their identity exclusively by their work, which is obviously deeply problematic when prostitution is so stigmatised. So sex work is work, and it's represented as work within the memoirs I'm examining. If anybody wants to read further about this, by the way, I really recommend Melissa Dura-Grant's Play in the Hall, as well as Molly Smith and Juno Maxwell and Prostitutes. I often refer to Grant's concept as well of the prostitute imaginary, which really powerfully describes the ways in which sex workers' identities are imagined and defined by others. It's important to know that sex work could obviously be incredibly dangerous as well, especially as sex workers, especially street-level sex workers, were persistently dehumanised by lawmakers and authorities. So many women and children were trafficked, exploited and abused. One of the memoirists I'm looking at, Anne Sheldon, was groomed by a board and raped at the age of 15, and remarkably she managed to establish herself in elite prostitution and fashion a successful career through living with a string of wealthy keepers. But it's important to note how precarious prostitution was, and even courtesans could be dependent on the whims of fickle men who could also be abusive. The memoirs I'm looking at really capture how empowering the sex trade could be for some women, but also how unstable and difficult it could be too. So it's important to reinforce just how diverse women's experience of prostitution were in this period.
That's amazing, thank you. I think that's really interesting what you said about terminology and our use of words, because obviously nowadays we do prefer to say sex work because that covers such a broad range of work as well. And then when we go back to the 18th century, they didn't have that term, so it's hard for historians or academics to use the term that an 18th century person wouldn't necessarily recognise, which is why we use words like prostitute, whore, those sort of words, not to dehumanise anyone, but because those are the words recognised. And I think that's super interesting that you raised that. And it's a big thing, especially when you're writing a thesis, to sort of lay that initial groundwork about words and why you're using certain words.
Of course, yeah, it's so important to obviously reinforce that, like, the differences between past and present. There's a whole load of kind of socio-historical stuff to account for, but yeah, absolutely. I think we have a responsibility as feminist researchers as well to use that terminology, because my thesis comes from a very, it's grounded in feminist theory as well.
So your PhD also looks at women's virtue, or the virtuous sex work. And virtue is quite an 18th century idea. Like, it's something that I associate very much with the 18th century, and we don't talk about it as much now. I mean, obviously it's still in our society, but could you tell us a little bit about the 18th century ideas of virtue in Ireland and England?
Certainly, yeah. I don't want to conflate English and Irish society too much, but standards of feminine virtue were generally bound up in codes of modesty, chastity, domesticity, and the ideals of the philosopher and writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau were incredibly influential in the late 18th century in particular. And he asserted that a woman who shows herself off disgraces herself. So there's evidence that his conduct literature was consumed by middle-class women in both England and Ireland. The standards of modesty and chastity could be really draconian, especially amongst the Irish Catholic community that one of the memoirists that I'm looking at, Margaret Leeson, belongs to. When she gives birth to her first child outside of wedlock, she's essentially disowned by her entire family. And interestingly, Rousseau's notions of feminine virtue gained renewed interest around the Revolutionary period. So he harked back to the classical ideal of this Roman matrona living a retired, private life. And many Republican commentators actually suggested that domestic and maternal roles were natural to women. So French Republican politicians essentially tried to push women out of politics by stating that these were women's natural contributions to civic life, that they didn't belong in public life fundamentally. And while feminist writers like Mary Wollstonecraft contested his ideals of women being passive and subservient, closed off from public life, she also repackaged these essentialist visions of womanhood in her Vindication to suggest that women should channel what she framed as these unique biological and moral powers that they had. So she made a case for their involvement in public life on the basis of these ideals. So the feminine ideal that emerges from the works of Wollstonecraft and other French feminists in the early 1790s is not altogether desexualised. She's passionate, but she's also sincere, she's compassionate, she's rational. She's certainly defined in opposition to sex workers, who are represented as these cunning, home-wrecking harlots, as Wollstonecraft puts it. And she also refers to street walkers as poor, ignorant wretches. So there's a very exclusionary dynamic at work in Vindication. But at the same time, in the late 18th century, there was a growing focus on the importance of authenticity amongst radical circles, especially amongst English Jacobin novelists. So without getting into too much detail about moral philosophy and the idea of moral sense, feminist writers were concerned with women's capacities to be true to themselves, to their moral impulses, to their feelings and desires, beyond the corruption of a misogynistic system, and beyond the strict codes of feminine conduct as well, chastity in particular. So feminist writers often use sex workers in their treatises and novels to represent their concerns about women's struggles to be authentic, especially as prostitution is heavily associated with female artifice in their texts, so it's juxtaposed with any kind of true passion or emotion. But the memoirs I'm looking at also value authenticity above the artifice of the misogynistic aristocratic circles they move in as well. So this is often involving rejecting conservative codes of virtuous conduct that were imposed upon women in this period. And prostitution often allows them to embrace their authentic selves, so it doesn't diminish their moral qualities or their sense of self. So they acknowledge how theatrical their work is, but it doesn't equate to complete moral degradation for them. Essentially, it doesn't have the same moral baggage. So the memoirs suggest that they possess genuine moral qualities such as compassion, which they can sustain alongside their work. So they represent these values as far more important than superficial notions of modesty or chastity. Of course, these are the accounts of women in the upper echelons of courtesanship, so we can't assume that every sex worker from every social strata had the same experience or interpretation.
That's wonderful, thank you. I think I'm having flashbacks to my master's degree, talking about conduct manuals. Oh, no, not for me.
Yeah, there's some interesting 18th century conduct literature out there.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So you've talked about Margaret Leeson and Anne Sheldon, the two women who you concentrate on in your thesis. Could you tell us a bit more about these women?
Yes, certainly. So I'm looking at the memoirs of Anne Sheldon, published between 1787 and 1790. I'm also looking at the memoirs of Margaret Coughlin, who I hope I can talk about in a little more detail as well. So they were published in 1794. And memoirs of Margaret Leeson, published between 1795 and 97. And these writers had all been high-profile courtesans in the late 18th century, so in very broad terms, they produced memoirs which reflected on their experiences in prostitution, which for Leeson spanned around 30 years. So discussing their initial falls, their entry into sex work, their many keepers, their outrageous adventures, their sexual exploits, and their financial struggles. They all have very individual accounts and different backgrounds. So Sheldon was born to a middle-class family in London, and was raped at the age of 15 by a naval officer and politician called Captain Walsingham. And she climbed up the ranks in elite prostitution, entering into arrangements with a number of high-profile men throughout her career. And then there's Coughlin. I personally think her life story is just too interesting not to discuss. So she was born in New York and grew up against the backdrop of the American Revolution, and her father was a loyalist soldier fighting for the British king, but she defines herself as a staunch Republican. So she was actually taken as a prisoner of war by George Washington.
Oh my goodness.
I know. But she notes that she was treated very kindly in the household of one of his generals. And she fell in love with a Republican soldier, but ended up being forced into marriage with an abusive husband at the age of 14. She ended up in England, where she entered into arrangements with a number of wealthy politicians and public figures. And then there's Leeson, who was born to a middle-class family in County Westmeath in Ireland. So she suffered horrendous physical and mental abuse at the hands of her brother, which she blames for her dalliances outside the family home. She became pregnant with a lover's child and gave birth outside of marriage. When she was rejected by her family, she got involved with her first keeper and climbed the ranks to become one of Ireland's most successful high-profile courtesans and brothel keepers. So that's the memoirs in a nutshell.
That's amazing. I definitely need to seek out their memoirs and read them in full. I've done a little bit of reading in preparation for this, but yeah, it sounds absolutely amazing. I love I love reading women's own work. I think that's really important as well, to centre the women when we do our research on this sort of stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. And they're just so, their stories and experiences are just so fascinating, so diverse as well. So definitely worth the read. Absolutely.
Awesome. So where do we find the writing of sex workers, and what forms does it come in? Because I've, done my own research on this and read what we call whore biographies, which aren't always as trustworthy a source as they could be, but equally, who are we to know? We can't ask them. So where have you found your writings?
So I have access through Newcastle Uni to this database called 18th-century Collections Online. I think it's a Gale database, but these memoirs are also available on Google Books as well, if anyone wants to access them that way. But yes, courtesans and other sexually transgressive women were publishing their memoirs during the 18th century, and particularly around the mid to late 1700s. So there was an appetite for these texts, mainly because of how outrageous they were. So they've been labelled by many modern critics as scandalous memoirs. Even though the memoirs capitalised on scandal, I do think that label can be problematic, and I'll discuss why in a moment. But the courtesan Teresa Constantia Phillips published her memoirs between 1748 and 1749, and they were explicitly titled An Apology for the Conduct of Mrs. T.C. Phillips, right? So Sheldon also refers to her memoirs as an apology in her preface, but the scholar Felicity Nussbaum notes that this could signify the root of the term in classical rhetoric, which also relates to a kind of defence. So the memoirs are outwardly projecting this image of penitence, aligned with the Magdalene caricature, which was really dominant in the 18th century. But they're actually more defiant than that. So it's really important to note that there are just so many layers to these texts and so many different discourses at work within them. And on that point, Caroline Brescius has done some great work to counteract the idea that these texts should be pigeonholed for their scandalous content, rather than acknowledging how fluid and experimental these texts actually were. So Sheldon, Congreve and Leeson's memoirs provide really good examples of this kind of generic experimentation, which also reflects just how multi-dimensional and ever-shifting their self-representations were. So they can't really be pinned down, in my opinion, and this helps them resist pre-existing stereotypes of the prostitute imaginary and Grant's words. So for example, Sheldon initially dresses her text up as a form of conduct book literature, and Leeson's text often reads like a work of feminist polemic, something that might stereotypically be attributed to Wollstonecraft. So my thesis is actually about drawing comparisons between the memoirs and the works of writers that are now generally referred to as revolutionary feminists. So demonstrating how the memoirs were actively expanding and complicating feminist discourses of the period with their new insights about prostitution and feminine virtue. Coughlin is a really interesting one because her text is, as she puts it, interspersed with anecdotes of the late American and present French war, and remarks moral and political. So she deploys her experience of prostitution as a basis for political reflection, exposing and condemning the corruption of aristocratic clients, and establishing her own Republican political arguments for social equality. So yeah, that's a bit about the kind of generic experimentation that was going on in these texts and how they were packaged and how the memoirs were representing themselves. But in terms of kind of how much we should trust the memoirs and the idea of, how truthful they are, whether there's some sensationalism going on or blackmail and revenge, etc. Especially, obviously with this proliferation of whole biographies in the period. So we can never say with confidence, we have access to an unmediated, authentic sex worker's voice from the 18th century. We just can't make that claim. Obviously, the memoirs had clear financial motivations for publishing their life stories, so they were at the end of their careers and all struggling financially. And Sheldon and Leeson's memoirs were released in 3 to 4 different volumes, so this allowed them to engage in a bit of blackmail against those who owed them money along the way. So Leeson would threaten to expose the men who owed her money in the next volume if they didn't pay off beforehand, which I think is just quite genius. And Sheldon's memoirs were advertised in newspapers with the names of the public figures who were going to be discussed. And I quote, "They promised amorous histories in which the principal persons of the kingdom will make their appearance."
Yeah.
I thought I had to include that quote because, yeah. So it's quite clear that these texts were geared towards sensationalism and entertainment, even though they profess to deliver moral lessons to their readership. So fundamentally, I would say the memoirs are textual performances. So Sheldon in particular often plays up the stereotypes of sex workers as like riotous and deceptive, but in comic scenes that actually serve to like poke fun at domineering clients and destabilise the patriarchal power systems that undermine her subjectivity. So on the subject of like authorship and editorial intervention as well, Leeson notes that the last volume of her memoirs were edited by a Catholic priest, which seems very sort of left field, but it was following her religious reawakening. So towards the end of her life, she kind of rediscovers her Catholic faith with the support of this priest. So her memoirs do sometimes sway from defiance to empowerment into these like sudden episodes of self-condemnation, often with like biblical reference points as well. So this may well be in part the result of the priest's interventions, but we'll never really know. On this point, I'd also direct listeners to Julie Peatman's brilliant biography of Leeson. I think it's called Peg-Plunkett Memoirs of a Whore, if anyone wants to check it out. But Coughlin's memoirs, the authorship of her memoirs have been heavily contested. But again, I'm going to say that Brashears has done brilliant work to authenticate them. But in the 1970s, one historian basically suggests that the political content of Coughlin's work could only have been added, and I quote, by a heavy masculine hand.
Right.
And came up with the theory that it had been hijacked by a radical hack called Charles Pigott due to some textual similarities between the memoirs and one of his texts. However, I've also shown in my research that the turns of phrase and themes that this 1970s historian rests his case on were actually very common within many libertine and radical texts of the period, and there's literally no reason why Coughlin wouldn't have engaged with them herself. So basically the generic fluidity of Coughlin's text is being undermined on the basis of these patriarchal assumptions about what kind of texts women were writing in the revolutionary period. And obviously nothing is definitive, so these hack core biographies were all over the place throughout the 18th century, and in many cases sex workers were being ventriloquised for the purpose of male titillation or for broader political agendas, often in male-authored pornographic works. But in terms of Sheldon, Coughlin and Leeson, there's no compelling evidence to suggest that they didn't write their memoirs, especially based on reviews of the period, which have absolutely no problem accepting their authorship.
Oh, amazing that you've got those reviews that, are completely in agreement that they were the author, to use those contemporary sources to prove your point. That's awesome. It makes me think of Teresa Berkeley's memoirs, which were lost after, I think it was like a brother or a cousin burnt them.
Oh, right.
She was the late 18th century dominatrix, and she ran a couple of brothels in London where she would offer all kinds of BDSM to her clients, who were everyone from, they're pretty sure, the Prince Regent through to all the MPs. And she wrote her memoirs, and in her will she directed for them to be published, but they were destroyed, and that is heartbreaking. That is one of
that is heartbreaking. Yeah.
It's
absolutely
one of those things where I'm like, maybe one day it will just turn up in someone's loft or something.
Oh, wouldn't that be amazing? Oh my god, imagine. Yeah, I know Leeson references this poem that was written by one of her friends. It's like an erotic poem, and she does a little advertisement for it in her memoirs, but that's just being lost as well. And it's just like, oh my god, a female authored erotic poem from the late 18th century, and it's just lost to history, unfortunately. So
it's awful. I was lucky enough to speak to Kathleen Luby about porn, and I asked her about why it was important to study porn. So I thought it would be really good to ask you why it was important to look for and study the testimony of 18th century sex workers.
Yeah, that is a really, really good question. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's the element of subjectivity in these memoirs. In a period where sex workers were just so heavily objectified, I mean, obviously they still are, but in terms of being objectified and mobilised for these broader kind of political agendas, or for the purpose of male titillation. So it's the idea of this kind of multi-dimensional, moral, maternal subject that emerges from these memoirs that we just can't find, I haven't found anywhere else. They're just so extraordinary. So they're just so complex, so layered, these texts. And as I say, these women can't be pinned down, they can't be categorised in the way that, so many 18th century commentators wanted to pin women down and categorise them. So I think that's why it's so important to study this literature and these texts.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't know whether it's me and things about that are sort of othered and you're discouraged from studying because it's perceived as being lesser or not as interesting or important, but it really is important to do your research on sex workers, criminals, pornography, all of those things.
Yeah, because the memoirists as well aren't just kind of, especially with Leeson, her memoirs isn't just about her own life. It's kind of like a love letter to all of the other women she comes across and builds friendships in these communities of care with. And that's why these texts are so important as well. They're so valuable in terms of giving us these insights into how women were actually living and how sex workers and communities of sex workers were living. So yeah, they're so valuable on so many levels.
Yeah, that's very, very true. And when I first came across your work at that KEX conference, you were talking about motherhood and sex work, which is not something that I'd ever thought about before personally. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what your research has found regarding motherhood and sex work.
Of course, yeah. So maternity is a really important theme within the memoirs, and it's led me to research sex workers' maternal experiences more broadly in this period. So despite the glaring connections between sex and reproduction, sex workers have been estranged from maternal ideals past and present. So in the 18th century, that maternal domestic ideal I talked about earlier was very tightly bound to chastity. So this was a desexualised, self-sacrificing maternal ideal who was devoted to her children, not concerned about her own sexuality or personal pleasure. So this ideal basically became an icon of Republican politics in the 1790s. In Vindication, Wollstonecraft stated that the woman who is faithful to the father of her children demands respect and should not be treated like a prostitute, which sums it up really. So she was concerned that middle-class women were being distracted from their maternal duties by male sexual demands as well. So even today we see this persistent cultural narrative that a mother's sexuality is essentially stripped away when she becomes a mother. So women are sorted into categories of feminine identity, they aren't allowed to be multidimensional. Rebecca Bromwich and Monique Marie de Jong talk about how mother work and sex work are perceived as polar opposites. So mothering is viewed as a legitimate use of female embodiment, as they put it, whereas sex work is perceived as the illegitimate use of female embodiment. So mother work and sex work are thought to be performed by different kinds of bodies, different kinds of women. So in 18th century prostitute imaginary, sex workers were defined in opposition to these essentialist ideals of natural motherhood, so generally represented as selfish, neglectful mothers. We see that play out in Defoe's depictions of Maud Flanders and Roxana, and Hogarth's Child's Progress as well. It was often believed that sex workers were actually incapable of conceiving or bearing children in the first place, due to the overuse of their reproductive organs or the spread of venereal disease as well. However, the memoirs represent sex workers bearing children and engaging in mother work. So Leeson's representations function to really decouple maternity from chastity as well. Off the top of my head, I think she gives birth to 9 children in total, and while documenting her struggles as a single mother at the start of her memoirs, she highlights the fact that these maternal ideals are dependent on women's material circumstances. So after being abandoned by her family, she talks about the limited options she has available to her. She wonders how a young girl with a child can possibly survive on a single guinea, and how she might be employed in service when she hasn't got a character. There's no mention of her daughter when she enters into prostitution, and if her daughter survived, she might have been settled with a nurse or another family. This was often the case for Cath women who became mothers, and future keepers often remained ignorant of their maternal status. But with her first long-term keeper, Lawler, she has 5 children, and she observes that her carer filled up every vacant hour of her time. So their relationship really demonstrates as well the blurred lines between Cath womanhood and marriage, as they really resemble this middle-class family ideal. So even though Leeson is in love with her keeper and it's more like a cohabiting situation, her sex work is facilitating her mother work fundamentally. So she actually suggests that their children legitimise the union as well. So she describes them as links of a chain, kind of connecting them together. And in really sentimental terms, she expresses her love for each child in her intense grief when they die. But then interestingly, she then sways into blaming herself for their loss, saying that they were taken away from her by God, partly because they were illegitimate. So that's one of those interesting parts of the memoirs that potentially, we question whether the priest's involvement is kind of heard there, but we'll never know. So later, when I keep abandons her, Leeson shows how the communities of care she forges with other sex workers help her support her children as well. So during her lying-in period, she's supported by her friends emotionally, physically, and financially. So in Revolting Prostitutes, Journal Mac and Molly Smith highlight the fact that sex workers have formed these communities of mutual support for centuries. And this is something that's been overlooked in accounts of feminist history. So it's important to know that former keepers sometimes provided financial support to former mistresses, especially if they had children together, but this wasn't always the case. So for Leeson, the support of other women is essential during this period. And when she reaches the peak of her career as a brothel keeper, she has a live-in nurse who helps her care for a 2-year-old daughter. She's pregnant and she's just matter of fact about making things work for herself and her children during this time. And she also provides quite an outrageous anecdote, which I have to discuss because I think it's amazing, about being heavily pregnant with one keeper's child, using the excuse that she's too indisposed to sleep with him, and sneaking another man, Mr. Cashel, into her bed. So she acts as a procuress by arranging for another friend to service her keeper sexually while she pretends to be ill. Cachel's basically penniless, but she has this overriding passion for him that she can't suppress. So, yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So in this period, expectant mothers were heavily desexualised, especially in medical treatises that urged men to remain faithful to their wives during the later stages of pregnancy and early motherhood. They were medically advised against having sex while breastfeeding as well. So Wollstonecraft was concerned about men imposing their own sexual agendas upon mothers, but there's absolutely no consideration of the notion that a pregnant woman might experience desire on her own terms, let alone with another man instead of her husband. So Leeson's appropriating so-called natural maternal concerns to actually disguise her true violation of these biological and social codes. So her lust is clearly selfish. It's described in very selfish terms. She looks back and she's like, yeah, my behaviour was pretty dubious at this point. But this anecdote provides a really multi-dimensional vision of maternal identity beyond this fixed, desexualised, self-sacrificing ideal that was imposed upon women in this period.
That's really, really interesting that we've got those testimonies as well that note how many dimensions there are to these women.
Absolutely.
There's not just mothers or not just sex workers. As with every human, there are so many facets to our lives, and we can't really just be pigeonholed into one sort of personality or characteristics. So yeah, it's really great to learn about that. Really interesting, especially about how obviously sex work supports motherhood financially. You're supporting your children by doing sex work, whichever form that comes, and that is obviously one of the reasons why people engage with sex work.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I think there's a lot you can do there with that research. This could go quite far, hopefully.
Yeah, this is kind of my favourite thing at the moment. I'm so interested. I'm so deep in this rabbit hole of maternity and sex work. It's just so fascinating. And as you say, it's just so relevant to today as well. I know I keep mentioning Mac and Smith, but I absolutely love Revolting Prostitutes. But they really reinforce that idea that, sex workers, many sex workers are mothers, many sex workers are supporting children. It is just the reality of things, and it was the reality back there too.
Yeah, definitely. I did actually buy a copy of Revolting Prostitutes after your talk.
Oh,
I've yet to read it. Yeah. And I do have had a copy of Playing the Whore for 6-7 years, and I started reading it and then did an MA and completely forgot to read anything.
It's fab. It's
for fun.
If you get around to it.
Yeah,
it's great.
Definitely. I can see the sun is out. That might be a treat this afternoon.
Yeah, good opportunity, definitely.
Thank you so much for talking to me. It's been lovely to have you. Where can listeners find out more about your work, any social media, or just find out more about your research?
Yeah, so I'm relatively new to Twitter, but I am trying to be more active on there. I'm trying my best. So my Twitter handle is Alex Collinson7. I'm actually juggling maternal duties myself at the moment, looking after a very lively 3-year-old while trying to finish this PhD. hopefully I'll get it in early next year. But in the meantime, I'm hoping that a chapter in an edited collection and a monograph will be in the works soon, post PhD. Awesome. So once I've submitted early next year, fingers crossed. But any updates about those or conference papers, I'll put on my Twitter page.
That's absolutely amazing to hear about a monograph and something in an edited collection. That is wonderful stuff. And I cannot even imagine trying to do a PhD with a 3-year-old. So
it's tough.
Goodness gracious, well done.
Yeah, I had to write at the beginning of the PhD. I started the PhD in October 2019, gave birth in January 2020. So yeah, and then lockdown and all the rest of it. So it's been
oh my goodness,
it's been a wild ride.
That is a story. That is an interesting few years. Oh my goodness.
Completely.
Well, thank you so much. It has been lovely to speak to you, Alex.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks again to Alex for joining me. It was lovely to chat with her about her PhD project, and I hope everyone listening enjoyed this episode. If you did enjoy this episode, you can leave Amorous Histories a kind review and some stars on your podcast app or website, should you so wish. You should be able to find me wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow my socials at Amorous Histories on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube and TikTok, and at Amorous Histpod on Twitter. Transcripts and sources are at amoroushistories.co.uk. Until next time, stay sexy.